guys, it's Stephanie. You know what time it is. Yes, it's time to talk best of the year. Now, usually I do a top 10, but this year I read more books than I have ever read in my life. I read almost 150 books. So top 10 was just too hard. So I didn't actually count how many books this was, but these were the best books I read this year. So you know what? Deal with it. I am really excited. This is one of my favorite videos to film. I know I look ridiculous, but that is part of the tradition. Usually I'm wearing a Grumpy Cat sweater and a Santa hat. Grumpy Cat sweater will come out for worst of the year, and I might pair it with double horns. We're just gonna lean into like the weird headbands this year. It's a thing. So how about we talk about the best books I read this year. These are not all books that were published in 2018. A couple of them are, but you know, they're not all new releases. Some of them are backlist. These are just books that I read in 2018. So the first standout book I read this year was The Unseen World by Liz Moore. I talked about this in my mid-year check-in. I am not going to do plot synopses for all these, but the things that I thought this did really well, character development. I really loved the concept that she was working with. We are following a girl who realizes that she really doesn't know who her dad is, and everything she thought about her dad is false. Her dealing with the discovery that her father is not the man that she thought she knew. Unseen World. First sentence. Hello, it said. Next up is Sleeping Giants by Sylvain Neuvel. Don't know why I picked this book up because I'm not usually a science fiction reader. I'm open to it, but that's not usually my genre. I listened to this on audio, which I 100% recommend. Like, if you're gonna read this book, listen to it on audio because it's a full cast production. It is fantastic. This is about a woman who, as a young girl, stumbled upon this giant metal hand, and they discover that that metal hand is not from Earth. And so flash forward to her as an adult being the leading physicist on a team that is working to discover the rest of the parts that go with this hand and everything that comes after they search and possibly find these parts that are not from Earth. It's like, listen, if you would have told me that I would be calling a book about alien robots one of the best books I read in 2018, I would have thought you were crazy. But let me tell you, I was so into these stories. I was very invested in these characters. I may have teared up a time or two listening to these books. I don't know. They just hit some kind of a sweet spot with me that I am saying they're amazing. So this is kind of the whole trilogy. Like that Sleeping Giants, Waking Gods, Only Human, Half Human, whatever the third one is called book. Check them out. And the first sentence in Sleeping Giants is, "It was my 11th birthday." So next up we have Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. I picked this up because it was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award for debut author, and I'm so glad I picked this up because obviously I'm mentioning it on this list of standout books I read. But this is about 4 horror authors that, as part of a publicity stunt, they have to spend a night in this haunted house and do this live stream interview with this guy who runs this very like clickbaity website, but all of them are kind of at a stagnant point in their careers, and so like they need the publicity, so they agree to it. So it's about the haunted house itself, but also these characters and what they're going through and how the house manifests itself to them differently and possibly the consequences of that. So I thought this was great. I love kind of the commentary on the different subgenres of horror and those how those authors interact with each other, but also dealing with haunted houses, which are one of my favorite horror tropes that I am just always here for. No house is born bad. Most are thought of fondly, even lovingly. In the beginning, the house on Kill Creek was no exception. Next up, we have Confessions by Kanae Minato. This book was batshit crazy. Like, if I could find any phrase to describe it, that would be it. I feel like my issue with thrillers is that they never quite go far enough. There's just always the threat of something happening, and I feel like very few times am I really satisfied with the follow-through of that. It just always seems like it's like missing like that extra push. In this book, I was like, what are you doing? Like, bring that back. That is like top-notch crazy. This is about a woman whose toddler-aged daughter was found drowned in a pool, and she suspects that it's a murder, and she goes about confronting the murderers, who may be children in her class. And just the events that spiral after you learn that, wow. Once you finish your milk, please put the carton back in the box. Next up is a 2018 release, and this was Paul Tremblay's The Cabin at the End of the World. I loved this book. This book was so stressful and claustrophobic, but basically it's a home invasion story. It's about a young girl and like her two dads, you know, just trying to have like a family vacation, and these group of strangers break into their house and they just have some crazy beliefs that they are trying to convince this poor family to go along with. And just like the physical and like mental stress of this book was so much. I had to like put it down. At times it made me like physically sweat. I was like, oh my gosh, I need to get out of here. This is an excerpt from an interview that I found, so I don't know if this is the first sentence, but it's, you know what? I think I have something for you. Nothing too great, but let's call it an early birthday present. Next on the list is Boy's Life by Robert McCammon. This book gave me all of the feels, if we want to use that terminology. This takes place in the 60s in Alabama, and it is a coming-of-age story, and it is so wonderful. It's got kind of these magical realism elements to it, and this often gets classified as horror, and there's like bad things that happen, but I would not say this is horror, and if horror is a term that is a bit of a turnoff for you, I wouldn't let that keep you from picking up this book. Like, this is definitely just a beautiful, touching, well-written coming-of-age story. It made me cry. And this isn't the opening line, but this is a quote that I really loved from it. See, this is my opinion. We all start out knowing magic. Next book I want to talk about is a horror short story collection that I read earlier this year. That was Darkest Hours by Mike Thorn. And I really enjoyed this book. So this book had some crazy stories. I will say the one that probably sticks out most in my mind is the first story, which is about a man who becomes obsessed with eating hair, and it makes you feel all kinds of things. Repulsion mostly, but like fascination also. And there were so many other great stories in this that I just had to pick it. It's a book I still think about. So that was Darkest Hours by Mike Thorn. Tonight, Theodore voluntarily ingested hair for the first time. The next book I want to talk about is also a short story collection, and that is Ghost Summer Stories by Tananarive. And these are all stories that are set in a town in Florida. There were some fantastic stories in this collection. I loved the first story in this collection. I don't want to go too much into it because you just have to read it. It's so great. This collection I wouldn't say is just horror. It has some stories that I would consider like speculative, some sci-fi, some like post-apocalyptic. There's a bit of Afrofuturism, and they were just so amazing and well written. And what I liked in this too, that I don't see in a lot of short story collections, is at the end, like a little excerpt about why she wrote them, or like what she was writing the story for, and like what she thought about it and what she wanted to get across, which I thought was really good and like a really good personal touch. Abby LaFleur was an outsider, a third-generation Bostonian, so no one warned her about summers in Gracetown. The next book I want to talk about is Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, and my arms hurt from holding this. It is so heavy. This is so well written, and I didn't know how I was going to do with this book because it's a classic, and let me tell you, I could not put this book down. I had to find out what happened next. Scarlett O'Hara is probably one of my favorite heroines. Like, I think she might be a sociopath, but I'm fascinated by her. Like, utterly fascinated by her. So this was just a fantastic story, and I definitely recommend it, especially if you're someone that's intimidated by classics and long books, because let me tell you, this ain't short. Scarlett O'Hara was not beautiful, but men seldom realized it when caught by her charms, as the Tarleton twins were. So the next book I want to talk about was a book I read for the Books in the Freezer readathon, and that is Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant. I was skeptical about reading because it's like creature horror, which is not one of my favorite things in the world. Everyone told me this book was about killer mermaids, And I just didn't know how well I was going to get along with that and how much I had to suspend my disbelief. But let me tell you, I loved this story. So Mira Grant spends a good chunk of this book developing her characters and getting you to know who they are and what they care about and what their goals and desires are, and you care for them as people, which is very important in these stories when they all have the threat of dying, because the stakes are so much higher. This was about a voyage where a documentary crew went to go, you know, do research on these like killer mermaids, and they ended up all dying. They're doing a second voyage to kind of see like what happened. And the main character in she is going on this mission specifically because her sister was one of the TV personalities on the first voyage who died, and she needs to figure out what happened. I loved her as a character. I think I also loved about this story is you kind of have that Jurassic Park feeling where it's like all of these scientists getting together and they're very excited about these new possibilities and what they could mean. And you kind of have that scene where like all of the scientists are getting together and like talking about their specialties and like what they're looking forward to. And I loved that whole setup. And this was amazing. I cared about everyone. I bought the killer mermaids. I was in it. I wanted to hear about their like weird killer mermaid science. Here for it. First sentence. Founded by James Golden in 1972, Imagine Entertainment was intended to restore the fun to the entertainment industry. Next book I want to talk about is Exorcist Falls by Jonathan Janz. This book was crazy. It is a book I find myself still thinking about. This is a novella and then a novel. And I can't go into too much about what happens in the novel because like it's all like the aftermath of what happens in the novella. But Exorcist Falls comes after the novella Exorcist Road, which is about these two priests who are called to a private residence in Chicago to look at this teenage boy who might be possessed. But even worse than that, they also suspect he might be the serial killer that has been plaguing Chicago, called the Sweet 16 Killer, who is targeting 16-year-old girls because he keeps spewing details about the case that only the killer would know. So like, is he, isn't he? I don't know. This book was done so well. Jonathan Janz is just a great storyteller, and he just did such a good job of like guiding you through this story and having you as the reader pay attention to what he wanted you to pay attention to, so that you were like awed and like blindsided by things and you just could see the masterful way that it was done. So 100% recommend this. They called him the Sweet 16 Killer. So next up I have The Dry by Jane Harper. This is the first of a series. It's an Australian crime series, and I loved this book. A lot of people compared this to the Dublin Murder Squad series by Tana French, and it is a perfect read-alike for it. It does bring its own things to the table. This is set in Australia, and you are dealing with a protagonist who is a police officer, but he works more in like financial crimes. It's funny how he ends up getting roped into these different murder cases. The first book, this one, The Dry, is following him back in his hometown for the funeral of his best friend and his family. He gets roped into / blackmailed into looking into their deaths. And everything that transpires and his connection to his hometown, everything in this book is just done so well. It wasn't as though the farm hadn't seen death before, and blowflies didn't discriminate. So the next book I loved was a young adult novel, and it was sent to me by the author, and I am a little surprised at like how much I loved this book and how well it was done, and it just hit every mark for me. Like, it had really good horror elements. The book was kind of supposed to be like this pop culture thing, and it definitely hit that. It had like really good characters. It was heartfelt. It was a good coming of age story, and it had, you know, very complicated family dynamics. So just like anything I could ever want in a story. And that was Scream All Night by Derek Milman. I feel like I talk about this book all the time, but like I love it so much. So go check it out. Slightly before dinner, Keenan House, the group home where I live, gets a call that my homosexual exorcism is scheduled to take place next Thursday at 4. The next book that I loved, and I was kind of worried about picking up because of how much hype I had seen around it, but I was so curious and I had to read it, or I had to listen to it. I definitely suggest doing the audiobook if you have the option. but was Sadie by Courtney Summers. This takes place in a small town in Colorado, and a young girl goes missing, and then her body is found. And then her older sister, Sadie, goes missing as well. And so you're following a true crime podcast that is interviewing Sadie's family and trying to figure out where Sadie went and what happened to the younger sister. And I believe the fictional podcast is called like The Girls. And you're also getting chapters from Sadie's perspective, and you kind of know what she's doing and what her mission is. And I loved the way this story was told, and maybe I loved it because so many times in this book, like, I just felt like I got punched in the gut. And I think when I'm reading, I love a good punch in the gut, like, knock the air out of you story. So well done. And I loved the chapters that were the true crime podcast that had, you know, like that violin intro and like that NPR voice kind of guy. The book starts out like, The Girls, Episode 1. Welcome to Cold Creek, Colorado. Population 800. And so it's like setting the scene for this story, and it was such a good time. The next book I loved was The Last Days of Jack Sparks by Jason Arnott, and this follows this like douchey social media personality author called Jack Sparks, and at the beginning of the book you know that he dies while he was doing research for his book on the occult. And so you are looking through kind of like his entries in his journal and like what was going on with him, while also, and since this is like a posthumous manuscript, you are getting input from people that are mentioned in the story and getting like their sides of what was going on. I thought it was so great. Jack Sparks was such a fun character. He was so awful and snarky, and I loved the way everything was done. This kind of reads at points like a found footage film, and there were parts of this that I thought were truly terrifying. Like, I would be reading this alone at night and get a little chill when things happened. So 100%, like, it was so good. So that was The Last Days of Jack Sparks by Jason Arnott. Before we vanish into Satan's gaping mouth, Bex wants to get something straight. So, hey guys, sorry. My camera stopped recording before I finished the last two books, so sorry if this is like a little bit of a change. But the next book I wanted to talk about was Grady Hendrix's We Sold Our Souls, and this follows a character named Chris who used to be in a metal band that was just on the cusp of hitting it big. But right before they had any kind of a break, the band had a falling out, and one of her bandmates like skyrocketed into stardom. And she is middle-aged, working at a Best Western, you know, wondering if her best days are behind her. And it comes to her attention that possibly the reason that that bandmate made it so big was because he made a Faustian bargain, but instead of selling his soul to the devil, he sold the souls of his bandmates. So she is on a mission to get back what belongs to her and confront her ex-bandmate. I loved this story. I was a little worried that I would be alienated because I'm not that familiar with metal, but I didn't find that the case at all. I found this very approachable, very fun, very fast-paced. You are very invested in Chris and her journey, and Quirk always does such a great job with these books. So like the pages have like black and the end pages are red, and then the cover has these like backwards lyrics. It's just so great and so much fun and such a good time, which is like everything I expect from a Grady Hendrix book. So this is We Sold Our Souls. Chris sat in a basement, hunched over her guitar, trying to play the beginning of Black Sabbath's Iron Man. Last book I wanted to talk about is a horror poetry collection called I Am Not Your Final Girl by Claire C. Holland. And I loved this poetry collection so much. I don't really read poetry, but everything about this book seemed really intriguing. So each poem is from the perspective of a female character in a horror film. A lot of them are final girls or, you know, the sole female survivor of a slasher story. These stories are, one, written so well and with this feminist point of view that just makes them resonate so well. They were so great. I just wanted to take these poems and just like sit with them for a little bit. This is a book I read on Kindle, but I like need my personal copy. One, because that cover is great. It's got like that worn out look and it has like that slapped on horror sticker. And because a lot of these are movies I haven't seen, and when I do see them, I want to have this book to refer back to and to read that poem and have it make sense to me in a different way now that I have context for them. Like, you don't need it. The poems are still fantastic and stand great on their own. I definitely recommend it. If you consider yourself a feminist, if you're like even slightly interested in horror movies, or you enjoy poetry, I can't recommend this enough. This was such a surprise for me how much I ended up enjoying this book. So that is I Am Not Your Final Girl. And I'm not going to read you a whole poem. I'll just read you the first line from the first poem, which is called Rosemary. It's from the perspective of Rosemary Woodhouse from Rosemary's Baby. And the first line is, "It always begins with the good intentions of men." So anyway, guys, those are my favorite books of 2018. Please let me know what your thoughts are on any of the books that I mentioned, or if anything I said has inspired you to pick up any of these books. I would love to know. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye!